Welcome to the Bible Weaver, where the ancient stories breathe again, where faith still trembles between the light and the dark, and where silence, though heavy, still speaks. If you have ever looked up and found no answer, if you've ever prayed and heard only the echo of your own voice, then this is your story too. It is not a tale of victory, nor a chronicle of defeat. It is the slow unraveling of faith, the trembling between why and how long, the quiet ache of believing when nothing makes sense. This is the story of Job, the man who faced the silence of heaven and learned that even silence has meaning. The morning in Uz began as it always had, the wind cool against the folds of the tents, the herds moving like shadows across the distant plain, the laughter of his sons echoing through the courtyards. Job rose before the sun, as he always did. He prayed for his children by name, for their laughter, their safety, their souls. He was not a man of fear, but of reverence. He believed that blessings were not a right, but a trust. The world around him was simple then. Men reaped what they sowed, and the righteous were rewarded. It was how he had built his life, a life of integrity, generosity, and quiet strength. He was loved, he was respected, and in his home, peace lived like a guest who never left. But peace, as he would learn, is sometimes the soft curtain drawn before the storm. Beyond the hills and the sands, in the realm that flesh cannot see, a question rose. It was not about wealth, nor about worship, but about the heart itself. Does Job serve God for nothing? That question hung like smoke before the throne. If the blessings vanished, would the faith remain? And heaven, in its mystery, allowed the test, not as cruelty, but as revelation. The hedge was lifted, and the winds began to move. The first messenger came as the morning light dimmed. His robe was torn, his eyes wide. My Lord, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them. They struck the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone escaped to tell you. Before Job could even rise from his seat, a second came running, dust clinging to his hair. The fire of God fell from heaven. It burned up the sheep and the shepherds. A third voice followed. The Chaldeans formed 3 bands. They raided the camels. They struck down every man. The courtyard spun. The air itself seemed to break. And then came the fourth. He was young, too young, and his voice broke like a reed in the wind. Your sons and daughters were feasting in their eldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came from the wilderness. It struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon them. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the sound of a soul collapsing inward. Job stood, motionless. The weight of loss is strange. It doesn't fall all at once. It comes in waves, each heavier than the last. He tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell to the ground. But he did not curse. He whispered, and the whisper was worship. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. There is a kind of faith that lives in gratitude, and another that is born in grief. And heaven watched in silence. Days turned to nights, and nights to days. The world had grown smaller, just the ashes, and the man sitting in them. Then the pain came. Sores broke out across his skin. His breath turned foul, his body weak. He sat outside the city gates, scraping his wounds with a shard of pottery, because sometimes the only control a man has left is how he chooses to endure. His wife came to him, her eyes hollow from sleeplessness. She had buried the same children, lost the same world. grief found no comfort in silence. "Curse God," she said, "and die." But Job looked at her, and in that look wasn't anger, but heartbreak. Shall we receive good from God and not evil? He could still say it, but the words now carried weight. Faith, once easy, now tasted like iron. When the friends arrived, they came not walking but crawling through grief. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite, men of wisdom, men of piety, men who believed they understood the mind of God. They sat with him 7 days and 7 nights, and spoke no word. For sometimes even fools know when to be silent. But then they spoke. They said that suffering must mean guilt, that God does not wound the innocent, that Job must have hidden sin. They offered reasons for mystery, as if heaven could be reduced to logic. Job listened, at first in patience, then in anguish, then in fury. "Have you no heart?" he cried. "Your words are wind. You plaster lies with your piety. If only God would speak. If only he would answer me." He looked to the east and found nothing. He looked to the west, and the silence followed him. "Even today," he said, "my complaint is bitter. I go forward, he's not there. Backward, I cannot perceive him." And still, he clung to one thread, one trembling truth. "But he knows the way that I take, and when he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold." He did not believe because it was easy. He believed because there was nowhere else left to stand. Night after night, he sat beneath the stars, the same stars he had once thanked God for. Now they seemed colder, distant, like eyes that watched but did not weep. He whispered into the dark, "Why? Why do you hide your face? Why give life to one who longs for death?" No answer came, only the wind. And yet he spoke again, because sometimes prayer is not words, but the refusal to stop speaking. The days stretched like years. Each sunrise felt like an accusation. Each sunset, a closing door. The earth beneath Job's feet no longer felt like home. He had buried his joy, his peace, his certainty. All that remained was breath, and the dull ache of waiting for what would not come. Sometimes the greatest torment is not pain, but delay, the feeling that heaven could end it all, and chooses not to. Job began to wander beyond the ruins. He no longer feared the dark. He had lived long enough to know that darkness is only terrifying when you still expect light. He passed the broken walls of his children's home, the stones scorched and split, the air heavy with ghosts. The memories clung like dust, a scent of laughter that would not leave. He sat beside the threshold where his eldest son once stood. The silence there was thick, the kind that swallows even thought. "Do you hear me?" he whispered. "Are you watching? If you see the suffering of the wicked and the good, and call them both tests, then what is justice?" No voice replied. Only wind, the kind that moves without direction, that carries the sound of distant thunder. His friends returned again. They had grown restless with his defiance. "Surely," said Eliphaz, "no one perishes being innocent. Your sin must be hidden, your pride unseen." Bildad leaned forward, his voice sharp. "The light of the wicked is put out. Admit your wrong, and you shall be restored." And Zophar, with the confidence of those untouched by pain, said, "If you prepare your heart and stretch out your hands to God, then your life will shine brighter than the noonday." Their words were polished. Their hearts were not. Job lifted his face from the dust. "You are miserable comforters," he said. "If only your silence were wisdom. You speak of God as though he were your servant, as though he must fit inside your reason. He turned away, his eyes hollow, his voice breaking. Would that I had never been born. Would that the day of my birth had perished. But still he lived, because something inside him refused to die. At night, the dreams came. He saw his children's faces, heard their laughter echo through the emptiness. He reached for them, but they faded like mist. He awoke trembling, covered in sweat, his hands gripping the earth as if to anchor himself to a reality. The moon hung over Uz like an eye that would not blink. He watched it drift through the thin clouds and whispered, "If there is justice, let me see it. If there is purpose, show me why." The wind answered with no words. It carried the scent of sand and the faint tremor of a coming storm. Weeks turned to months. His sores healed into scars. His friends left, tired of defending heaven to a man who refused to submit. Even his wife no longer came to the ashes. He was alone, a monument to unanswered prayers. And yet, in that loneliness, something shifted. He no longer demanded. He no longer argued. He simply watched the horizon and breathed. The silence had not changed, but he had. He began to understand that perhaps God does not always answer because he never left. Perhaps silence was not absence, but presence too vast for words. Then one afternoon the sky darkened. It began as a whisper of wind, low, circling, cautious. The birds fled, the trees bent, the air thickened with the smell of rain that would not fall. The wind rose until the mountains themselves seemed to move. And from within that storm, a voice. It did not come from the sky, nor from the earth, but from everywhere at once. It was not a shout. It was not thunder. It was being itself, speaking. "Who is this?" it said, "that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" Job froze. The sound pierced through every wound. It was not anger, but truth unveiled. "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you understand. Who stretched the line upon it? Who set its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" The words fell like waves, breaking his pride, washing away the ashes that clung to his soul. Have you commanded the morning since your days began? Have you walked in the springs of the sea? Do you send forth the lightning? Do you know its path? Job's breath caught. The wind whipped around him, but he no longer felt afraid. For the first time, he realized the questions were not to humiliate him, but to awaken him. The storm was not destruction, it was revelation. He fell to his knees. "I had heard of you," he whispered, "by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes have seen you." He trembled, not with fear but with awe. In the middle of chaos, he had found the stillness he had begged for, and the voice, as if smiling, grew gentle. "Gird yourself like a man. I will question you, and you will answer me. Shall he who contends with the Almighty instruct him?" Job lowered his head. "I lay my hand upon my mouth. I will speak no more." The storm quieted. The air became warm again. The dust fell slowly to the ground. He had no answers, but he no longer needed them. For once you have seen, you do not ask. When the clouds cleared, the world looked the same, but nothing was the same. The fields were still barren, the stones still broken, yet everything felt different, alive again. He stood, his body frail, but his spirit steady. The silence that once haunted him now felt like home. He understood what few ever learn, that faith is not certainty, but surrender. That trust does not begin when we understand. It begins when we stop demanding to. That night, he looked up at the stars again, and they no longer seemed distant. They were singing. He had simply been too wounded to hear it before. The constellations stretched across the sky, Orion, Pleiades, the Archer, all glowing like notes in a celestial song. "Now I see," he whispered. "You are never gone. You are in the wind, in the dark, in the waiting." And somewhere beyond the edge of the world, heaven smiled. When dawn came, it came softly. No trumpet, no miracle, only light, the kind of light that slips between clouds, touching the earth as if it remembers what mercy feels like. Job awoke beneath that light. His body still bore the scars. But something had shifted deep inside, a peace that did not depend on explanation. He stepped outside his tent and felt the wind against his skin. It was the same wind that once tore through his world. Only now, it was gentle. He closed his eyes. It whispered, not with words, but with warmth. And for the first time in what felt like eternity, he smiled. People began to return, the ones who had fled when his name became a curse. Neighbors who once crossed the road to avoid him now came carrying gifts, gold, rings, bread, oil. They said they had always believed in him, but Job no longer cared to measure truth by human tongues. He had learned that pity often arrives only after the storm has passed. He welcomed them anyway. He gave thanks, not for what was restored, but for the simple grace of company. His friends came too, the ones who had accused him. They bowed their heads, unable to meet his gaze. The air between them was heavy with shame. But Job, who had learned the weight of forgiveness, lifted their heads. He prayed for them, and heaven listened. The rains returned. The earth opened itself to the sky once more. Green crept through the wasteland. What had been barren now bloomed in color. 1,000 small resurrections. Job watched as his flocks returned to life. His herds multiplied. His lands filled again with the sound of living. The world called it restoration. But Job knew better. It was not a gift, it was grace. And grace is never about having again, but about being again. He had not been rewarded. He had been renewed. Years passed. Children's laughter filled his home again. Their voices rose like songs of dawn. Sometimes he would stand at the doorway, watching them chase the light across the fields. He would remember the ones who came before, the ones the wind had taken. But grief no longer owned him. It lived beside him, a quiet companion, a reminder that love can outlast loss. When he spoke of them, he did not weep. He smiled, because love, once given, does not vanish. It simply changes form. At night, he still prayed, not with demands, but with gratitude. His words were few now. He did not speak to be heard. He spoke to remember. "Thank you," he would whisper, "for the silence that taught me how to listen." And perhaps heaven smiled again, because what God could not teach him in comfort, he had taught him in quiet. Sometimes visitors would come to hear his story. They would sit before him, young men hungry for wisdom, old men searching for peace. They would ask, "How did you survive? How did you still believe?" Job would look at them for a long moment. His eyes carried a light they could not name. And he would answer slowly, "Because faith is not about holding on. It is about being held." The words hung in the air like incense. They said little, but they lingered. In the years that followed, his beard turned white. The strength in his hands faded, but the stillness in his spirit deepened. He had walked through ruin and resurrection, through questions and silence, and now he stood at peace with both. The people of Uz came to call him blessed again. But he no longer believed in such words. He believed only in presence. For he had learned that God does not dwell only in the blessings, but also in the spaces between them. There were nights when he would step outside alone. The air would be cool, the stars scattered like embers across the sky. He would tilt his head upward and whisper, "Are you there?" And though no voice came from the heavens, he would feel it, the quiet pulse of divinity that now lived within him. Silence no longer frightened him. It was the language of intimacy, the stillness between heartbeats, the pause before creation speaks again. He understood now that when God seems absent, he is listening closer than ever. As the years turned into decades, his story spread. Men told it around fires. Mothers told it to children before sleep. But most misunderstood it. They told it as a tale of endurance, of patience rewarded. Job smiled when he heard such things. They missed the truth. He had not endured for reward. He had endured for revelation. Because in the silence, he had seen more of God than in a lifetime of words. One morning, he woke to find the world unusually still. The dawn had not yet come. The air felt suspended, as though creation itself was holding its breath. He rose slowly, his bones aching, his steps soft on the earth that had known his tears. He walked to the doorway and looked out at the horizon. The first light of the sun was rising, and the color of it felt familiar, as if heaven was opening its eyes once more. He breathed deeply, and for the first time in all his years, he did not pray. He simply listened to the wind, to the silence, to the God who had never truly left. And as the light touched his face, he whispered one last time, "Even now, I know that my Redeemer lives." That was the end of his journey, but not of the lesson, because his story was never about loss, nor even about restoration. It was about the transformation of faith, from something spoken to something known. Faith that survives silence becomes unshakable. Hope that lives without answers becomes holy. And love that endures pain becomes eternal. When the people came to bury him, they found him at peace. His face was calm, his hands folded as if still in prayer. The wind moved gently through the fields, carrying the whisper of his last breath across the valley. The sun rose that morning brighter than any before, and somewhere, in a place where pain no longer speaks, a voice said, "Well done." The story of Job did not end in reward. It ended in revelation. And revelation is not given to explain God, but to remind us that he was never gone. For even in the ashes, even in the silence, even when the sky feels empty, he still breathes. And those who have walked through the silence will tell you, the whisper at the end is worth the wait. The story of Job lingers, not because of what he lost, nor because of what he regained, but because of what he became. When the fire had burned away everything, when the wind had silenced every voice, what remained was faith stripped bare, not the faith that seeks reward, not the faith that demands answers, but the faith that whispers, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." That is the kind of faith heaven remembers. Generations passed. His name became a proverb. The land of Uz turned to dust, its stones buried beneath the sands of time. But his voice still travels. It moves quietly through centuries, through hearts that break and rebuild, through prayers that rise from hospital beds and battlefields and empty rooms. When a soul whispers, "I don't understand, but I will not stop believing," that is Job speaking again. His ashes became seeds, and every time someone chooses to trust in silence, those seeds bloom. Faith is a strange thing. It is not born in light, but in darkness. It does not grow in laughter, but in tears. It does not live in certainty, but in surrender. The world says faith is strength, but real faith often feels like breaking. Because faith is not the denial of pain. It is the decision to love through it. Some say God was cruel to Job, that he allowed suffering to prove a point. But those who have walked the desert know better. Pain is never the goal. It is the language of awakening. When all that is unnecessary is burned away, what remains is the soul as it was meant to be. Naked, honest, free. There is a place beyond understanding. A sacred stillness where words end. It is there that Job finally met God, not as a judge, but as presence. And in that presence, all questions dissolved. Because when you stand before the infinite, you no longer need to know why. You only know who. Now my eyes have seen you. That line became the heartbeat of his story. It was not triumph. It was transformation. He had not learned new theology. He had discovered new sight. The same eyes that once wept in the ashes now saw holiness in every grain of dust. The same ears that once begged for answers now heard God in the sound of the wind. When we read of Job today, we see our own reflection. We see the nights when prayer feels like talking to stone, the days when hope feels naive, the silence that mocks our faith. But Job's story tells us that silence is not the enemy of faith. It is its cradle. Because faith that only speaks when God speaks is not faith, it's transaction. Real faith speaks into the void and calls it holy. There is a moment in every life when heaven goes quiet, when the music stops, when the world keeps turning and God seems to turn away. But in that quiet, something sacred is being written, something that cannot be spoken yet. The silence is not punishment, it is preparation. It is God carving a deeper space inside the soul, so that when he finally speaks, the echo lasts forever. Job did not just survive his silence, he became its interpreter. He showed us that endurance is not about waiting for pain to end, but learning to find meaning while it still hurts. And when that meaning appears, it does not explain the pain, it redeems it. At the end of his life, the scriptures say, Job died old and full of days. But that line means more than age. It means fullness, completion. A soul that had seen the face of God and learned that to see him once is worth 1,000 unanswered prayers. Somewhere in eternity, the man who once sat in ashes now walks in light. His laughter fills the air of heaven. And perhaps, when the angels speak of him, they do not call him the man who suffered, but the man who listened. Because in the end, that was all God ever asked, not to understand, but to listen. The story ends as it began, with silence. But this time, it is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of peace, the same silence that covered the world before the first word was spoken. The same silence that followed, it is finished. The same silence that holds the breath of resurrection. The silence of God is not empty. It is full of him. And those who have heard that silence will never be afraid of it again. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Those were his first words in the ashes, and they became his last in the light. The Lord gave, the Lord took away, and the Lord remained. That is the truth at the heart of all faith, that beyond every loss, beyond every unanswered prayer, beyond every long night of the soul, there is still God, unchanged, unmoved, unforsaken, the God who whispers, the God who listens, the God who remains. If you are walking through your own silence now, remember this. You are not forgotten. You are being formed. The pain that feels like an ending is the beginning of something eternal. And when you come through it, you will not be the same. You will be deeper, quieter, truer. And one day, when another broken soul asks you, "How did you survive?" you will smile and say softly, "I didn't. He carried me." The wind still moves through the hills of ooze. The dust still dances under the light. And somewhere in that eternal hush, you can almost hear him. The voice of Job, woven into the breath of the world, whispering still. Even in the silence, he is still God. If this story found you in your waiting, share it. If it spoke to your silence, keep it close. And if it reminded you that faith is more than answers, then you have heard what Job heard. Subscribe to the Bible Weaver, where ancient stories still speak through the quiet, and where every silence hides the breath of God.